Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this short presentation on pragmatic methods for increasing response rates above and beyond traditional methods of offering incentives or applying refusal conversion procedures. My name is Mansour Fahimi. I am with Marketing Systems Group, and I hope you find my outline for this presentation is to start with a quick overview of diminishing response rates. Then we get to the meat of the presentation, which is methods that we can use to improve response rates. And then we talk about some of the consequences of adopting such strategies, and then finish up with a few famous last words. So diminishing response rates are not new or news to any one of us. We all are struggling with this. This chart shows the monthly response rate for an ABS push-to-web survey that has been conducted for the past 11 years. So each dot represents the monthly yield rate. And as you see, they have been declining over the years. There are some fluctuations here and there, but once you put a regression line through the dots, you'd see that indeed response rates have been declining at an estimated 0.6% every year. And of course, this is not unique to address-based surveys. Same challenge exists for telephone surveys. This chart shows median response rates for the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey of the CDC, which is a telephone survey. And here you see median response rates for the past 2-3 decades. Again, once you put a regression line through these dots, you'd see that response rates have been declining here at slightly higher 0.7% every year. So in the past, currently as well, we have been relying on incentives to deal with increasing non-response rates. And as you know, incentives come, generally speaking, in two flavors. You can have non-contingent incentives, such as putting a dollar bill in the mail out. But of course, although they may help us get our foot in the door, such attempts can be pretty sizable. And unfortunately, a good number of those mailouts and the accompanying dollar bills, $2 bills, will not reach the intended recipients. Or you could rely on contingent incentives by promising some kind of reward should the addressee or the recipient partake in the survey. For this method to be successful, the amount or the type of reward needs to be notable, which immediately eats up a good chunk of the budget. And unfortunately, these incentive types can attract a lot of flies, a lot of fraudulent respondents. And then in terms of follow-up attempts, these days, for them to be effective, you really need to rely on callbacks, cellular callbacks, which can be very expensive, and they seem to be plateauing as well. And therefore, knowing that incentives and follow-up attempts are costly and only somewhat effective in certain instances, the question becomes, what is a researcher on a budget supposed to do? Are there any stones that have remained unturned that we should look under? And in particular, are there some distinguishable characteristics of so-called survey-friendly households that could be pre-identified based on the data that we may have available to us on the sampling frame? And then the question becomes, should such households be oversampled? And if we do so, what are the consequences of that kind of disproportional sample allocation? Obviously, the positive thing, on the positive side, we can increase overall response rates and reduce costs. at the expense of requiring more weighting adjustments, which would reduce the effective sample size. So to see if such a process is achievable, we started with a fairly large sample of about 500,000 addresses that were used to conduct the survey. And then we appended lots of ancillary data that were available to us from various sources to each address, meaning respondents and non-respondents of that survey. The ancillary data came from several sources, including L2, which is a commercial source, where we got hundreds of variables or indicators about consumer behaviors as well as voting data. We also relied on segments that could come from Newstar. These are 173 segments, where each of the 140, 150 million US addresses can fall into a segment based on various characteristics. We also relied on census data for geographic delineations and also the CBG, census block group level response rates that census provides. The modeling part of it was fairly straightforward. Once we had that fantastic analytical database of 500,000 addresses with lots of information available for both respondents and non-respondents, we went ahead and used stepwise logistic regression to identify significant predictors by reducing the pool of potential predictors of almost 1,500 down to a few dozen, 42. Then we sharpened the tools and used more aggressive segmentation techniques such as random forest and CART to reduce the 42 predictors down to a set of 21 key drivers of response. And once that set of key drivers were identified, we profiled each of the 500,000 addresses into various subgroups based on their response propensity measure. This chart shows that indeed we were able to identify, in this case, 14 segments or subgroups with varying response propensity, as low as 1.8% all the way to 38%, where in fact the overall survey response rate was only 7.4%. So this means that we could identify households or addresses that have a significantly higher response propensity, as well as those that were not very survey friendly. What this means is that we can therefore go ahead and oversample households where we expect to see higher rates of response and undersample those that have are expected to have lower rates of response. Of course, we don't have to do this in a willy-nilly fashion. We can go ahead and use available statistical and mathematical tools that are at our disposal. So to do that, if you can humor me with a little bit of notation, if we assume that we have H strata, the number of addresses in each stratum is denoted by capital N sub I. Variability of key outcome measures in each stratum is indicated by S sub I, and the cost of data collection in each stratum, think of it as cost per interview. CPI is given by C sub I, and then thanks to our founding statistical fathers, we know we have an optimal allocation tool that says the total sample has to be allocated across various strata proportional to the variability and size of each stratum, and inversely to the cost of data collection for each stratum. And of course, this allocation needs to be applied cognizant of the increase in unequal weighting effect or variance inflations that would result when we depart from a proportional allocation scheme. because, as we all know, additional weighting will reduce the effective sample size. So altogether, and in terms of conclusions, I think it's important to recognize some new realities that we are dealing with. Response rates are on a perpetual decline. There is no second guessing that. Non-response is differential and it erodes representation. I do not subscribe to the academic point of view. Some researchers hold that non-response and bias are orthogonal. That doesn't make sense to me. As we have talked about it, incentives and follow-up attempts are becoming costly and ineffective. And then beyond incentives and follow-ups, therefore, what we can do is we can identify households with higher response propensity, and we can oversample such households to reduce cost. Of course, that oversampling needs to be done judiciously, knowing that any differential selection will result in inflated variances. And while we're at it, I would like to end with some philosophical mentions. I think purism, just for the optics sake, is getting old. That means multi-frame samples, or the so-called hybrid samples, are going to be inescapable. And multi-mode survey administration methods are going to be inevitable. So we need to sort of wake up and smell the coffee. With that, I thank you for your time, and here is my contact information if I can be of any utility and help to you. Thank you very much.